As everyone logs in, Matt, I'll cover the Q&A as well when we kick things off.
Sounds good. Am I still shooting for about 20 minutes on our piece of it?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Perfect. For those that have already logged in, welcome. We're going to get rolling in about a minute. Good to see lots of friendly faces already logged in. Thanks for joining us. We can just share a lot of good Ohio stories if you like.
Just a glutton for Donato's pizza. That's my love of Ohio.
Beautiful. I think we've got a few attendees from Ohio here tonight. For those attendees, will be another 30 seconds and we'll jump right in. Perfect. All right. Well, let's jump in. I saw a bunch of emails from a couple doctors that we're going to be running a few minutes behind. We've got some great registrants and attendees so far, and let's jump in. So it is 7 p.m. Central. Welcome, everyone. We've got a very special seminar this evening for everyone. We are really going to be digging into some of the top questions we're getting now throughout the entire nation, specifically about the impact of COVID as we've now into halfway through 2021, talking about opportunities, talking about growth, talking about looking to standardize, streamline, and grow the organization. Let that be through expansions, relocations, or simply renewing or renegotiating the lease. And also, as a continuation of what we did last night for the Southeast, really helping to address a lot of the fear and anxiety about practice ownership, adding a new practice, or even generally about, what are the risks and impacts and process for gaining financing. So we've got a great team here of presenters for you tonight. First of all, Matthew McCarthy is our expert representing Bank of America this evening and the entire central region of the US. Who is incredibly knowledgeable, was responsible for helping to open up the Arizona office after starting in Ohio, and then certainly now being a key resource throughout all of central regions through the US. Matthew, thanks for so much for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Fantastic. Also, our senior consultant that works all through Texas and North, Mitchell Bronstein. Thank you for joining us, Mitch. Looking forward to some great real estate updates here momentarily.
Yes, of course. Good evening, everyone.
Fantastic. And myself as the president of Cirrus Consulting Group, really looking forward to having a great interactive course, helping to make sure it's customized based on those that have joined us, as well that are joining us through the webinar and recording afterwards. So from that perspective, to help to make sure it's customized, what we'll do is pull up a quick poll. So take a quick moment here to help customize the content and make sure it's relevant for all. Give us a quick sense in terms of objectives for this evening. So number one, the purpose purpose of joining the course tonight, general knowledge, specifics, right? If there's a specific concern regarding your lease or current financing. Also, questions about rental rates. A lot of the questions, a lot of the emails, a lot of the phone calls that Mitchell and I have been getting coast to coast are really predicated wondering about, with all of these vacancies and all these for lease signs, what does that mean for me? Am I in a good opportunity to look towards taking that Rockefeller glass half full approach? And maybe now is the catalyst to potentially make that next investment or step in your career. In addition, then, number two, what's your current situation? Are you looking to buy or build? Are you looking to expand and relocate? Are you looking to, you know what, COVID, I just want to get the heck out. Right? How do I help to facilitate that? How do I make sure that I can transition and assign my lease in the next few years, right? Or, you know what, I just want to dig in, stay put, right? And help to structure a long-term lease to maximize your financial wins. In addition, also, maybe you've already looking to buy or have bought a building and really looking to see how can I structure it appropriately to help separate the two different corporations, right? Let it be your building corporation or your practice corporation. Or looking for, you know, hey, how else can I save some money? If I renegotiate my lease, what about refinancing? And we've seen a lot of doctors that I've spoken to personally have leveraged these incredible rates, looking at refining to help save some money in the long run. Also, a little bit about current lease expiries. And also, we will have this coming up. But for those of you that aren't sure or have some concerns about their lease or questioning about current market rates, there's a quick option for number 4 that allows us the opportunity to help schedule a complimentary review or consultative call. All right, perfect. On that note, let's jump in. We've got a lot of good content. We'll keep things moving quickly. As the moderator, as a reminder, there is no CE credits for tonight's course. We do look forward to having things to be very interactive. So first of all, question and answer section is up live, and we will do our best to handle those as we go. Or we have allocated some time at the end for some extensive Q&A. Last night, we had over 30 minutes of great questions afterwards. So I would encourage you to certainly feel free to add Q&A as we go, or we'll cover it towards the end. All right, let's jump in. A quick purpose, process, and payoff from my good old days in Dayton, Ohio. So the purpose tonight is number 1, what's new, right? In terms of local real estate markets, update trends, what are we seeing nationally? What are we seeing throughout the central US? And what does that mean for you? Does that mean increased leverage? Does that mean supply and demand issues? Where does that come from? In addition to that, understanding the importance of the office lease, right, to your wards, your practice, the important key terms and leasing considerations, and a lot of those $100,000 traps. There's a lot of questions now about, look, COVID, I laid off my staff, the number 1 hit to overhead became the tenancy expense, and suddenly the landlord wouldn't even pick up the phone. Or I tried to get 1 month deferred. What did the landlord do? They wanted 3 years worth of financials. So we're going to touch on some of those, as well as really getting into what are lenders looking for and how can you leverage that to your advantage, especially with some tips and tricks. A little bit about us as our host for this evening. We are the only healthcare specialized tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. We're 27 years in the business, over 12,000 successful lease negotiations done. We're unique. We have in-house attorneys, lease negotiation teams, as well as consulting departments. We've got over 300 active negotiations currently, coast to coast, and we work with over 500 per year. Also, we're very proud to have worked with Bank of America for well over a decade, help supporting their clients from every step, from the very ideation stage all the way through to being chairside. All right, on that note, let's jump in. So we have access to an incredible amount of data, specifically to help ensure that what you see and what you have for your specific area and or right into your specific building to know what the latest trends are. What are vacancies? What are rental rates? What are the trends doing? So let's touch on that now. As a reminder, of course, we're going to look at some of the analytics from some of our licensed software. Again, our crystal ball is only as good as yours, but we will look at what some of the data is telling us. And right, it's unknown exactly what's going to happen, especially with COVID, but let's look at the data. So from that perspective, I'll pass it over to Mitchell, our real estate expert for Central US.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Eric. And again, a lot of these analytics, they really do help us make good predictions. So just looking at a national market growth update, some pretty scary stuff last year. Saw a very, very big drop in leasing activity across the country. And that's, I mean, the obvious answer for that was COVID. A lot of businesses working from home, a lot of retail businesses going out of business means a lot less square feet being leased for commercial space throughout the country. So very, very scary. And whenever you see that market rent go down, the alternative to that is always an availability go up. So typically the rent rates will drop, but it's not a healthy thing for the economy. But for a brick and mortar business like a dental practice, definitely a very advantageous time to negotiate rates. So Eric, just look into the next slide. So we were able to track the leasing activity on a yearly basis for the square footage that's used across the country. And throughout 2018, 2019, upwards of over 400 million square feet were occupied. And then 2020, obviously a very big drop. And 2021, just with the early numbers, a big drop as well. So the data for this year is not complete as we're only just over halfway through the year. But with a very big drop in leasing activity, so just square feet that's being occupied for commercial space across the country, throughout Texas and the Midwest, of course. It's a lot of vacancy, a lot of availability. For those of you on the webinar tonight who have vacancy in your building, it's a huge piece of leverage that you can use when you're discussing your renewal or potential expansion for your office space to say to your landlord, I know that you've got empty space. I know that there's vacancy in the building. And typically for our clients, that's what we use as a part of our advantage to leverage just some good improved renewal terms. So a more focused market update, first looking at Chicago. Again, looking at the vacancy rate highlighted in that yellow orangey color, you could see for 2020 that vacancy rate was trending, kind of plateauing throughout the past couple of years. It was holding steady. And with all the predictions looking throughout the rest of the year and moving forward, the prediction is that it's going to go down, right? More businesses are opening up, more people are able to go into shopping centers, et cetera. The vacancy rate will drop. And then with that drop in the vacancy, the opposite will happen for the rental rate, right? More demand means higher value, and the rental rate, just that blue line, will continue to increase. And that's the prediction for Chicago, and a very similar narrative for Houston. And Houston, much like the rest of Texas throughout last year and this year, has had pretty promising numbers. You can see the rent values there are higher, but that's just because Texas has had the benefit of being opened up. So a lot more inventory being used throughout Houston and other parts of Texas. So very similar, but just a higher value. Denver as well, somewhat similar to Minneapolis, but you can see the correlation between the vacancy rate and the rental rate per square foot. So looking at Denver as the major hub in Colorado, the vacancy rate forecast is looking like it's going to drop. So with that big increase for the vacancies going up and up over the past year plus, the forecast is that it's going to plateau and then slightly decline. And then obviously, again, the alternative, or the opposite of that rather, when the vacancy rate goes down, the rents will continue to increase. And then looking over at Minneapolis, the vacancy rate, again, predictions are that the vacancies will drop. And then the inverse for the market rates to continue to go up. Again, a very big correlation for the supply demand factor here, displayed and illustrated in commercial real estate. And then Detroit and Indianapolis, I believe, are two final kind of more in-depth and focused just vacancy and rental rate reports. We have a lot more of a reduced value in the dollar per square foot mark. So the trend right now for mid 2021 is for office and retail space that their dollar value per square foot is $21. And anticipated market rents are supposed to go up again as the economy continues to rebound and businesses can open up and experience customers coming into their shops. And of course, again, with the opposite of that, the vacancy rates will continue to decline, and very similar for Indianapolis.
Perfect. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank
Okay.
you, Eric.
So, really, what's the takeaway for that? Obviously, each market is a little unique, but many of them tell the same story, which is that, right, what a lot of economic factors are showing right now is that there is a great time, and based on the estimates for moving forward, that as the economy goes back, the vacancies go down, rental rates go up. So again, as I see it, we've got a great window of time to be helping to leverage those opportunities, right, and those vacancies, especially with some landlords that might be squeezed a little bit between a rock and a hard place. In terms of some of the survey results, thank you so much. Some high response rates here. Number one, there's a few that are in a month-to-month type of situation. A lot, looks like over 43% have a lease that's due within the next 2 years. A number of you, about 29%, own their own building. So we'll touch on specifically some strategies for you as well. A number of you with looking for help for lease, as well as curious about market rates. Perfect. Great. So, and also for those of you looking to buy or build, we'll touch on some strategies based on what we're seeing now coast to coast with some of the hundreds of files we have. Those of you, 14% looking to expand or potentially relocate. We'll touch on that perspective because it can be a catalyst, right? As you're renewing your lease or you're contemplating, you know what, and do I really see myself here over the next 10 or 20 years? Maybe now is that little nudge in the right direction to say, you know what, maybe it's time to put the old fishing pole in the water to see what that landlord might want to do to earn my business down the street. So fantastic. Thanks for the updates for the polls. So as Mitchell and I are usually on planes and in San Antonio and being able to be in front of 30 or 40 of you, we always ask this question: what is a lease? What does that mean for you? Right? And it's a contract, it's terms, we go around the room, but it's interesting. Underneath it all, it is one thing and one thing only. It is a check. It is a check to the largest individual, central person or entity that you would pay to in your entire personal or professional career. So as you look at your lease, take a different perspective. Our goal is not to make you a lease expert or a financing expert tonight. The goal is to have a different view, a different appreciation, and to start peeling the onion as to some of the key things to look out for. But what's unique is a lot of doctors will focus on the first half of the first page: base rent, annual increases, term, and that's it. Yet there's another 65 pages of other stuff in there that the landlord has obviously made a significant investment within. So start to look at the next renewal, or for those of you that might have a renewal on your desk, as I saw from a few emails earlier, right? Look at that as take the monthly payment, multiply by the 12-month term. Over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you can be looking at a multi-million-dollar check commitment to that landlord. So if you were just about to sign $1 million check, right, would you look at that a little differently? Right? Would you want to make sure you've got the best possible terms? Would you want to make sure that you've got protection for yourself and your estate if heaven forbid something were to happen to you? So that's exactly some of the key things we're going to be touching on at a very high level. Okay, let's talk about this. So for those of you, the 29% of you that have owned and own your own buildings and locations, ask yourself the question: what is the state of your estate? Meaning, start looking at the business from a few different perspectives. And what, unfortunately, we heard a lot of devastating stories of a doctor that may have passed away over the past year. And unfortunately, it left the estate and the spouse in a very difficult situation. So as you're going through this exercise, think about who owns the building. Is it yourself personally? Is it your spouse personally? Is it in a corporation, right? Who are the shareholders of that corporation? Second level is then your practice, right? Are you the sole shareholder of your practice? Do you have Do you have an associate that might be a minority shareholder, right? What does that look like? And then also looking forward, right? How do you envision that transition working? Who are you going to try to sell the landlord and your $1 million practice? Because if so, that's a big nut. So to be able to, right, for Matthew, to be able to get, a loan for $1 million building plus $1 million practice is a lot for a new associate. Many doctors much prefer to retain ownership of the practice and get that passive form of income into retirement. To do so, obviously, we need to be thinking about the lease as if we're a full-time landlord. So lots of reasons to discuss. If you don't have a lease in place, or if you downloaded something from the internet, I would strongly suggest you'll have an opportunity here shortly, scheduling a quick call with Mitchell or myself, or one of the members of our team, and we can start to talk about some of those strategies. Much easier to get it done now than it is when you're just about to sell to your associate and the ink is still wet on the lease that you've then created. Much easier to say, no, this is a lease I've used between myself for the past 10 years, and you're then just assigning it to your eventual buyer. So lots of great things to talk about for those that own their own real estate. And also ask yourself, how are you paying yourself? Right? If there's not a clear delineation of financials and you're using the same credit card to fix the roof as you are to buy a new piece of equipment for Henry Schein, for example, that can have some material impact to making it very difficult to separate those two down the line. So let's talk about leverage for a little bit. This is, sometimes we'll do a poll for this one, and it's really predicated on the perceptions. Right? Now, every landlord's unique, every tenant's unique, of course, but think about yourself for a second from a different perspective. Right? In my opinion, you are the best tenant on the planet, and here's why. Right? Number one is you have the lowest default rate of any other commercial real estate tenant. You have the highest build-out costs, $200, $250 per square foot. Right? Typically, the dental practice is in the same location for over 26 years, right, or longer. And also, from that perspective, you're also bringing in high-quality foot traffic, and above all else, right, you're COVID-proof from that perspective. So even as shutdowns occur, right, dental practice are remaining open. So from that perspective, right, put yourselves in the landlord's shoes for a second. And if you've fallen into the trap of saying, oh, I got 12 other doctors that are going to sign the lease tomorrow, right? Don't underestimate how important you are. If you were to leave, that could be 2, 6, 12 months of vacancy that the landlord's trying to find someone else. And then the cost to bring someone else in and the build-out costs, right, are a major undertaking, right? So don't underestimate your value and your leverage to take advantage of that. There's 7 main financial variables. In the essence of time, each one, I can tell you, many landlords have looked at it differently. And with the data, we've had some real significant wins about maximizing that. But don't think linearly. There are 7 different valves on the wall. And maybe by taking less tenant improvement allowance, for those of you looking to open a new practice, right? Maybe that's the opportunity then to take less base rent. And when looking at it over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I would much rather you go to Matt to get a larger loan than taking $50,000 from the landlord, which results in a 10% increase in rent, which you end up paying 3, 4, 5 times the amount over the term, which keeps on going up and up and up, right? So be cautious about any sort of money or tenant improvement allowance from the landlord. Let's jump into a case study before we pass it over to Matt. So this is a great example that for those of you that are driving, don't read leases and clauses as you drive. But this is a section in the lease that if you have a digital copy up and you're on your monitor at the office or at home and with a side-by-side, it's found in about 90% of leases. So the option to renew clause describes if and how you have the ability to extend the lease and under what ability and what happens and what's the mechanism for you to exercise and renew that lease. Right? Options are typically good for the tenant, right? And it'll be usually equal to the initial term, meaning that if you have a 10-year term, typically the landlord will be offering 2 5-year options. So if you've had a quick chance to review, what do you see as some red flags? Usually at this point in our seminars, Mitchell and I joke that, boy, oh boy, who likes reading leases? Right? Well, it's the equivalent of us reading a book on advanced endodontic procedures. We do get a kick out of this because we know what to look for and we know the importance of it. So let's look in. So as you can see now, here are some of the specific red flags. So if you notice the first one right in the first sentence, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, full stop. So what that means is that's great for Dr. Black. However, if Dr. Black sells it to Dr. Smith at the end or at 9 years into a 10-year term, even though there might be 2 5-year options, that is no good for Dr. Smith. So, and if then Dr. Smith goes to Mr. McCarthy and says, Matthew, I'm really looking for, beautiful practice. I want $1 million, but there's only 1 year of term left on the lease. That's going to be a major red flag for underwriters and getting that deal pushed through because there isn't that predictability and continuity of revenue, right? What is the likelihood that you will not have any major bumps in the roads or end up out on your ear with your chair, suddenly needing to go back to Matt for another $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 to suddenly build out a practice down the street, right? Again, as you can imagine, that would be devastating. Also, be cautious. As it states here, it's only if the tenant is not in default. So ask yourself last year, if you delayed payments, if you were, made any sort of abatement or deferrals with the landlord, did you get it documented? If the landlord asked you for your financials as COVID ramped up, if you didn't send them, but through your lease, you were required to within a 15-day period, you may be in default now and not know it. Or if you brought in contractors, made changes or otherwise, and that didn't receive the approval of the landlord, that could also be in a default situation. So what you want to avoid is a surprise and try to be 3 steps ahead prior to that renewal. Typically 2 years prior is the best time to start the process. Midway through here, any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So what's the point in negotiating a lease if the landlord can hit the reset button and start it again from scratch? And then, of course, unbelievably, in no event shall the rent be less than the last year of the original term. So at that point, you're on the world's most boring roller coaster, or some of the famed Six Flags down in Texas. So cost of the mistake, again, can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, can impact the sale of your practice and beyond. Here's one example of a letter that one of the doctors in Texas had emailed us from a friend who he thought was his friend, who was the landlord, who was a doctor next door, non-dentist. Right. So this doctor had built out a beautiful practice, right, was signed a 5-year term and everything was working well. Right. And this was his golfing buddy, landlord. So he gets this letter, right, that his lease expires. As you know, your lease expires November 14th, 2018. Pursuant to section 2.4 of your lease, you had an option to renew the lease for 5 years market rates. However, you were required to give me written notice of your intention to renew, but not later than 6 months prior to your expiration. So this was like 3 days after that date was missed, which you did not do. Please be advised that my broker will be placing a for lease sign in a conspicuous but non-intrusive place, right, on the premises next week. So imagine a for lease sign that was right in the center of the window, right? And he'll start showing the premises to prospective tenants during business hours. So now your chair side, your hands are in the patient's mouth, and now you got people walking through looking to take over the space. And then at the bottom, I love it. Oh, by the way, if you want to stay, right, have your people call my people, and we can start to maybe think about a new deal. Right? So be very cautious. The 2 things to add into your phone this evening are, number 1, when does your lease expire? And number 2, when is your option to renew deadline? Those 2 things are critical dates and part of the critical dates and risk analysis that we look at, right, as part of the review. In the essence of time, these are just some of the clauses that we focus on that are negotiable and are something that you want to be very aware of. Let it be acquiring a practice. Let it be if you own your own real estate and are contemplating selling the practice separately in the future. For those thinking about buying, expanding, even renovating or expanding, these are the type of things to be aware of. If you're not sure what some of them are, if they're not sure, if you're flying through the lease right now on a digital copy or on your phone, right, and you're not sure, right, you can email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. We're happy to walk you through it to make sure that you're clear. At least know what's there for you. So how do we help to break the cycle? So one of the first things that we recommend that we see is working quite well in most cases is to start the process early. The more time you have, the more leverage. We've done it 12,000 times. Typically, right, what many will do is wait, or maybe reach out to the landlord. Hey, our lease is coming up. Oh, no, come back and see me a year later, right? You reach out 12 months prior to expiry. Come back in 8 months. Suddenly then they delay. Yeah, we'll get back to you. Suddenly now you've missed your option to renew deadline. You've lost your leverage, and now you're just waiting. Right? Don't fall into the landlord's playbook. Be proactive, right? And some of the key things to do are to leverage the opportunity we have ahead of us now, right? Leverage the market rates, leverage the very low rates that are available, right? And also leverage the fact that landlords are quite anxious to be doing deals. The process for that, right, is to get all the information first. If you don't have a digital copy of your lease today, or one that's signed by both the landlord and yourself, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Very easily, no difference for a PPP or otherwise, email the landlord, ask for a digital copy. You should be aware of what your current contractual obligations are. And yes, it may go back to 1988 when the original doctor signed it. If it's just renewed year over year over year, and you just assigned it when you bought the practice, unfortunately, it might be a lease that you're not even aware of. Number two is identify those practice and career goals. Figure out where you want to be and how you want to get there. Have your lease professionally reviewed. Number four is get the market rates. And number five is figuring out that carefully choreographed game of chess. Where do you want to be as an end game? What do you want that lease? What do you want that practice to look like? Right? Unfortunately, what do many do? They attend one of these webinars and say, oh my God, I got to call the landlord right away, pick up the phone, skip sections 1 through 5, right? And completely then play into the landlord's hands. Oh, hey, what do you want me to charge? What do you want to charge me? Right. So be proactive, right? Follow the steps, and to help ensure that, again, you're being proactive. You are leveraging your high degree in value to the landlord and helping to support it from your practice and your business from start to finish. As we pass it on to Matthew, as mentioned, in appreciation for everyone's time, we are able to schedule a consultative call for you, right, and your business partner, spouse, or otherwise, where we do a full analysis of your lease, right? We go through the market rents and otherwise in your area, and we waive, based on what we have here this evening for your attendance, we waive the $1,995 fee for the critical dates and risk analysis, that lease review. So there's a quick poll that'll pop up, again, keeping it easy. If you're unaware of what's within your lease, if any of these have created some questions, right, quick poll to identify that. For those of you that are, the 22% of you that were in a month-to-month lease, I would suggest making that an urgent for number 3. That can expose you, and it can dramatically impact your ability to sell the practice. If the landlord can put a brown envelope on your door tomorrow and in 30 days you're out, as you can imagine, that makes the valuation incredibly difficult and puts yourself, really, your entire value of your practice sale proceeds into the landlord's hands. Right. And again, if you are coming up in the next 2 years, or maybe it's over 5 years or otherwise, right? What does that look like for you? And also, right, how do you help to, if you are expanding, are relocating, or even making some major renovations, right? If you're going to Matt and saying, look, Matt, I want to do a major reno through my entire practice, Matthew, I need $150,000. And here's all the key things I'm going to do to bring my practice up to snuff. Look at your lease first. what so many doctors do is they invest all this money into the practice, right? And then the lease comes up in a year or two, suddenly the landlord laughs and says, you're not going anywhere. You just spent all this money. Oh, by the way, here's a 20% rent increase. All right. So think long-term, be proactive, and help to make sure that maybe it's a great opportunity to ask the landlord, right? Many landlords, just like we did for Dr. Sam Thatcher, dentist for the San Francisco Giants, we were able to get a ton of tenant improvement allowance just right for paint and carpeting and some upgrading the windows. Right? That was done just as part of the renewal process. All right, perfect. Really appreciate everyone's feedback and involvement here. Again, as a reminder for many of you that joined afterwards, we will be going through a bunch of Q&A. Feel free to add through that as we go. All right, and certainly the pièce de résistance, Matthew McCarthy, thank you so much. And over to you to really help to cover a lot of the fears, anxieties, and demystifying the process of gaining financing and helping to make sure that you're starting the practice or growing the practice off with the right foot. Matthew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciative of both yourself and Mitchell giving the chance here to speak to the group. I can speak in volumes to how many transactions and situations that doctors have been, I hate saying held hostage by the landlord, but that is a very real situation. So I think the biggest emphasis here is absolutely looking at your lease and understanding what is going on and what you're trying to get into, because it is the worst situation when you're not expecting it. So my goal here today for everybody on the call is to really just go through some of the main things about financing when it comes to practice financing, as well as some of it's going to seem incredibly basic, but what we have found over the years is that some of it is a good refresher, especially if you are looking to expand, relocate, even from a refinance of existing practice, that all of it is applicable and all of it will hopefully help clarify your plans as you go forward. So we're going to go ahead and go through the agenda here and give you guys an idea of what we're going to go through. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about what does the average dentist look like coming in for financing, whether that is starting an office, doing a second location, relocating, buying a building, building a building, just giving you kind of a concept of what we normally see. We're going to do a little bit of a 101 on what some of the products that are out there, what it should look like when you get financing. It's a common misconception that we focus so much on the loan and the rate, frankly, that we miss all the extra pieces, much to Eric's point earlier, in rental rate. It sometimes becomes a flashy thing, but I will tell you that landlords know that, and so do banks know that when it comes to rates. So trying to understand everything that you're in for when it comes to doing business is important. Cost of doing that business, the business ownership and the cycles of that business, and then lastly, we'll talk about what are some takeaways, some things I think everybody can really do regardless of where you're at in your practice ownership. So going to the next slide, we're going to talk about typical client. So obviously, if you already own a location, then the associate piece is thankfully you're past that. So congrats for that first part of it. If you haven't yet, if you haven't either bought or started a practice, usually we see doctors coming out somewhere between after their first year to their first couple of years before they really start engaging with the idea of starting their first or buying their first location. From an earnings perspective, that can range significantly depending on the health of your practice. One common misconception I think that happens a lot is that doctors will look at two offices and just talk about the collection marks of those offices, and they could both do $1 million, but one might only make you a couple $100,000 and one might make you $400,000. So there can be a large disparity there. And to the point about leases, the sustainability of that business also plays a large role in how you can kind of count on that income going forward. Student loans, I wish they wouldn't include this piece, because I don't think any of us want to talk about it. But we know and we understand student loans. So being dental specific financing and being an expert in this space, we understand the cost of the profession is absolutely student loans, and they're absolutely increasing. It's understandable. One of the pieces we'll talk about is how, if you still have student loans, to leverage the practice, to grow the practice as the most significant vehicle you have to pay those off. I think a lot of times the student loans we come out of school with, we desperately want to get rid of them. However, capital you're throwing that way, dollars you're using to pay those down, might be better served in other areas. So we're going to go through that a little bit. From a personal debt perspective, we're going to talk a lot about what it looks like today, what are some choices that the doctors do make, and frankly, the ripples from those. There's no part of this that is good or bad. I will tell you that it is more about you understanding when you make a call, you make a choice, like a common one might be, should I buy a house first before starting a practice? Or if I'm going to relocate my office, does building a home at the same time cause any problems? Things like that. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just understanding the ripple that is created from those choices. And then lastly, savings, liquidity. It is becoming more and more important as we get into kind of situations like COVID, for example, although it was a crazy example, one none of us were expecting, but it definitely put doctors in a tight spot if they didn't have the savings to float those situations, or they weren't sensitive to the cash flow of their practice, which you'll hear me say cash flow a lot and why it's so important. Go ahead and go to the next one. So this is the basic breakdown of a credit score. Again, some of you, this seems incredibly rote or that you're very familiar, but what I've found is there's some doctors that are still a little bit in the dark in terms of what makes up their credit scores. Dentists as a whole, obviously repayment is incredibly strong. Eric referenced it earlier. The default rates on loans and the default rates for doctors is incredibly low, lower probably than any other industry. However, understanding, again, the choices that you make and how that reflects in your FICO does play a role when you're trying to get financing, or any financing for that matter. We're obviously a very FICO-based society. So pay history is obviously the biggest part of this. Amounts owed, your length of history, the type of credit that you have, and inquiries. The two that I'll touch on right here that I think really can kind of cause some confusion, credit inquiries is a common one. There is a fear, I think, that doctors have of getting their credit pulled a lot, especially when they're shopping for loans. I will give you some assurance that they have done a better job lately of helping so that if you are shopping for loans in terms of if you're expanding or building or anything for that matter, multiple inquiries don't hurt you the same way they used to, as long as they're within a certain span of time. So usually that's about a 2-week window if you are shopping for credit. Amounts owed, your revolving credit, is probably the thing that will be the biggest red flag for a lender. If it is an extraordinary amount, and I'm saying beyond what you need to run the business, for example, so obviously a lot of doctors use it for their supplies and whatnot. But if you have 4 cards that are maxed out, like even if those limits are available to you, banks are going to see that a little bit of a red flag. So be sensitive to it, especially when you are trying to get financing, that it might not be the time to go crazy on some new furniture purchases or the boat or whatever it might be if you're leading up to a situation where you're going to need funding. We can go on to the next. I'm not teasing anybody that has a boat, for the record. If you have a boat, forgive me. It's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just something
boats,
to think
cars, ranches, you got it.
No Ferraris. So, yeah.
One of the things I saw actually yesterday that was very interesting was one of the best practices shared in last evening's course was amounts owed. So, I'll typically just pay whatever the statement balance is, so I'm never paying interest. But the other best practice from last evening was, as you're going to apply, just bring that to 0. So even though you're always using your card, you're always paying, you're not paying any interest. But, right, certainly as it looks too, with your liquidity, right, the best practice from last night was just paying that off a month before. And that certainly helps to show that you're not just carrying a balance, you're not carrying a larger balance. And that can certainly be assistance. That was something that was new to me last evening.
Yeah, and Eric, thanks for calling it out, because it is absolutely something where it comes up commonly. Doctors will, write out that they have no credit card debt, and foreseeably that they don't, because they pay it off every month. But to your point, if it shows up on the bureau, which it will, if you show a statement balance, even if you might not be accruing interest on it, we're going to have to factor that in, that there's still a liability as it stands. And so it is absolutely something you can be strategic with going into requesting financing, understanding your statement dates and understanding that you might be rolling or showing more credit card debt than realistically you feel that you have, which is part of kind of the theme to this conversation tonight is have the conversation. This is an easy conversation that we can have on the front end when you're thinking about expanding, relocating, refinancing, starting, buying, whatever it might be. A lot of times the worst part about it is when we come to the back end. Decisions have already been made. We're already trying to fit something, a square peg in a round hole. It is so much harder when if we can on the front side talk about it and game plan, even if that is a year or 2 out, because that will play a large role in understanding where your practice is going and know the markers you're shooting for. So with that, these are the kind of the main products we offer for doctors when they are looking to finance. Project financing is pretty self-explanatory. That is relocating, remodeling, expanding the office, doing another location. This applies to startups, truly coming straight out of school and wanting to start your own office. We have a specific way of doing projects to really make sure that you have a chance to grow and get into a spot where you can get into a healthy place before you have large loan payments. A lot of times what we see from either local institutions or places that maybe not specialize in the dental side aren't giving you the breathing room that you might need to get in a healthy spot for the office, so you're not feeling this stress point of a large loan payment. So our project financing is built around that and to give you time to get a second location or get a relocation situated. I will tell you, no matter what project you're talking about, it never comes in or comes out the way you thought it was going in. It's always going to either be longer than you thought or maybe a little more costly than you thought. I think a lot of people have probably experienced that recently with supply costs going up. So again, it's important that you work with a lender that can be flexible and also understand there's going to be some variability in it. Debt consolidation, this is incredibly important today. So going back to that cash flow comment I made, what a lot of doctors tend to do, and it makes perfect sense, is that they're growing, they take a lot of either equipment loans out or lines of credit, or they get short-term loans to solve kind of a knee-jerk issue, right? Whether that's another chair that you need or a piece of technology. The downside of that is they're usually shorter-term loans, meaning your payments are higher, and you get kind of this plateau point where your overhead's so high and you really need that extra capital to maybe pay into marketing or to do something to grow, but you can't. So what we like to do a lot of times is free up cash flow if we can. We'll roll everything into one loan. I've seen scenarios where doctors are paying $22,000 a month in their debt. We're lowering the rate and now they pay $8,000. It can be a very game-changing feeling to your office if you feel right now that there's just not enough wiggle. So that's why going back to that cash flow is so important to put you in a good spot to do what you need to do for the office. Equipment financing is pretty self-explanatory, practice sales and acquisition, and then commercial real estate. Again, all these pieces we have specialized products for to really be mindful, and I'll say it again, that your practice is the number one vehicle for growth. And that's why Eric is spending so much time on your lease, or even if you own the building, why it's so important, because it will play a larger role in your ability to manage your debt as well as to gain wealth, is ultimately how healthy you run that practice, which is why we do all of these different products for you.
Just maybe just to piggyback on that, where that quick call to Matthew or one of the members on his team, be cautious, because you might think, hey, gosh, I'm just paying too much to the landlord. I guess I better just go to Matt and get a commercial real estate loan. Well, you can, but think 3 or 4 steps ahead, right? Anybody can go out and buy a piece of commercial real estate, right? However, because you've got DDS or DMD behind your name, you have access to this exclusive revenue generating asset, which is a dental practice, which can be far more lucrative with far more profitable returns by adding a secondary or third practice. Right? And you don't have to look far to see it. Many of the multi-roofs, multi-rooftops, multi-site, or even large DSOs, their operating businesses don't own any real estate. They're putting all of that available capital into opening the next clinic and the next clinic and the next clinic, because right, that can yield a far better return than necessarily the commercial real estate, especially if you're looking to sell or sell multiple locations in the future. So again, if you're not in that game yet, but you're contemplating, what, should I buy my next one or not? Really make sure you've talked to Matt, and or Mitchell to really help figure out what that long-term career goal looks like. Don't just have that knee-jerk reaction driving home and saying, hey, what, maybe I'll pay $500,000 to buy that building.
Absolutely. I think it's a common misconception that we either hear of a friend or we just get in love with the idea of owning real estate. It can be a safe bet, but it is not the almighty. And I think that is a key distinction to Eric's point. If you look at a lot of the larger groups, it is very seldom that they own the buildings accompanying those practices. And there's a reason for that. Flexibility is part of that, and the ability to transition an asset. Going to kind of what we just talked about, here's the 3 main things to kind of take away, if you will, as to when you're thinking about successful growth. How is your debt going to impact you? Going back to what we just said, short-term debts or high payments or inflexible financing can really hurt how quickly you can grow or get to that next stage. Liquidity, when you do have a bump in the road, what happens? You have what you need to insulate yourself so that the business can keep running. A lot of doctors, if you think about it, if we didn't have PPP or EIDL and different programs that help, liquidity was really it. Like there's really, from a resource perspective. So keeping that in the back of your head, that is absolutely important. And that's what banks are thinking about too. Production, this goes into kind of everything about how that office is running. There is absolutely something to be said about being mindful of your expenses and your overhead, but ultimately what will make you the most money is the production of the collection in the office and how efficient that collection is. So here's kind of a timeline, if you will, for project financing. This is anybody that is relocating, trying to get a second or third location, or if you're starting out, this gives you kind of a baseline for where you would start at. Establishing a plan. Where do you want to go? How big? What does that look like? If you're relocating, is that the right call? Engaging Cirrus to make sure, hey, is it maybe a better situation to stay here? Can I get TI allowance from my landlord and rebuff the space? A lot of times when we hear about relocations, it's because doctors are fed up with the cosmetics of the space. So don't rule out bringing in an expert to really help kind of bolster what you could do in your existing spot, or it might be the right plan to go ahead and relocate and grow into a larger space. Establishing your budget, again, that is that conversation on the front end. Getting that figured out now versus getting in love with a 10,000 square foot space and realizing that the rest of it's not going to play out the way you want it to in terms of financing or having to be able to afford it is a terrible feeling. So we're just trying to save you from that, or it might be the other way. You might be shooting too low. It's something where you're looking at a smaller space and you could do better. There's a lot of reasons to just have the conversation and figure out your plan before you start finalizing decisions. Otherwise, you run the risk of it not getting to fruition. Pre-qualified, again, the conversation we have, finding a space, using local specific dental brokerages, as well as using a expert lease negotiator to help with getting that space situated is incredibly important. Applying for the financing, finalizing your design, creating your marketing plan, these are all pretty self-explanatory, and then starting your project. Again, I can't emphasize enough, get the plan together, get the decisions, get the conversations going now so you're not left at the 11th hour trying to piece it all together. This is your team. This is incredibly important when it comes to doing whatever it might be you want to do. Building a building, starting a practice, moving, have a dental specific team that can support and help you. Because ultimately, when you find quality people to help the growth of your practice, they are incredibly invested in making sure you're successful. It is a mutual success that we're working towards. At the end of the day, I tell most doctors when they are looking to kind of start their project, this is a little bit like your board of directors. And it sounds a little cheesy, but like truly, this is your board. You're trying to put people and put experts around you that know what they're doing to really help you be successful. The dental specific component of this is so huge. This is why companies like Cirrus exist, because there are a lot of local brokers or doctors doing their own deals. And unfortunately, they miss very big things that can cost them a lot of money in small ways and in big ways, right? We hear all the horror stories. There's also really small things that happen every single day that doctors get hit on because they didn't use somebody that understood their field and understood what they're capable of. So using a dental specific group of individuals to help build your office is probably one of the slides I would take a picture of or really note. Find a team that you can trust that understands your profession and what you're trying to do. So this is the part I mentioned earlier about your loan, the options that you have. The loan is one piece of it. Where they grow with you and where they help you is the second part of this, and maybe the more important part. As ultimately, if you're a practice owner, you're more than likely in this for a while, or at least to a point where you're going to want to transition and sell the practice at some point. Having a relationship with a bank that understands that is possibly could save you more than a rate competition will ever matter. So having a face-to-face relationship, this is why there are There's about 80 of me across the country that are there to be in different markets to understand specifically. That's why we have Mitchell to understand specific industries and markets, because it matters, right? And San Francisco is not the same as Dallas or New York City for that matter. So understanding your marketplace is incredibly important. Knowing your profession, like we talked about. Fixed rates. It sounds kind of silly, but there are still loans out there that we see all the time where doctors are going to have to guess what the rate's going to be in a couple of years. That's not a fun game to play. 100% financing. We want to keep your cash in your pocket. It goes back to the point I made. The most you can do with your money is build your practice. That is literally the thing that will make you more than anything else we really talk about, is investing in your business and helping it grow. Flexible terms goes back to the project financing that we talked about, low fees. These are something that gets constantly missed. I'll have doctors come in and they'll say, Matt, I'm getting, the rate is 0.25 lower. I'm like, cool. There's a $20,000 buy-in piece. I don't know if you saw that you're going to pay 20 grand to get that rate. Maybe not as cool as we thought it was. No personal collateral. This plays in a lot of ways. And this actually leads over into what Eric was talking about. There are so many situations where we see doctors getting on the hook for things they didn't anticipate, whether that's their house. I've had landlords hook their practices and not know it, and the doctor couldn't get financing anywhere else because they had a lien on their practice. The collateral piece of it is huge. Most banks should take a lien on your practice. That's usually the extent of it. And then further, future growth. If the bank's not going to be there in 5 years, or they're just going to stop lending to practices, that should play a role in your decision making. We've been doing it for 25 years and specializing in dental for a reason, and we've seen a lot of banks come in and try to do this and then leave, and that leaves a lot of doctors on the hook if they're working with a bank that's not going to be there long term for them.
And on that personal collateral, as a reminder, we're going to jump to Q&A in a moment, but Dr. R, Dr. P, great questions coming through. A lot have been about, personal guarantees. So in many cases, the landlord will also want to stick some hooks in about you being a guarantor. And if you're an established dentist and you paid your rent on time, you've been a great tenant, why? Why is there still a personal guarantee? And more importantly, most of you will be shocked to find out that even after you sell, that personal guarantee continues, right? Forever, as long as the lease continues to renew. So that's that continuing liability as well. Perfect, Matt. Aren't you?
Absolutely. Tying into the last slide, same concept in the value of the loan, but along with that, the other items to be thinking about. What insurances do they require? Do you have to move your checking account and keep it there? Your merchant services, your payroll processing. Bank of America has really tried to build a program around giving doctors and small business owners specifically the most money back in their pockets to grow that business by building the more that you do with us, the more rewards we give you. It's meant to complement. It's not meant to hamstring you. That's not true for all banks. There are banks absolutely that will require you to do certain pieces that again, they might dangle the piece over here, which might be the rate or might be the structure, but ultimately they're banking on the 10 years of doing your credit card processing and charging you a lot more than you maybe thought you could get. So be cognizant of more than the rate. The rate's one piece of it, but the rest of it does really play a role. And we'll get to these last couple of slides. I think this is really important to give you guys an idea of, depending on where you're at in practice ownership, this is what you can expect as the practice progresses, as your careers progress. You're entering the market, you're growing, you're maturing, and then you're transitioning out. All of these phases are worth being cognizant of today. Ultimately, they will play a role at some point or another. It doesn't mean you have to make everything actionable. It does mean that they should play a role in your decision making. When you're looking at your lease, when you're looking at your loan, how does this play out in the next 10 years, and does this help me or does this hurt me? Again, there might not be a bad or a right or wrong call, but you being clear on understanding the ripple impact of those decisions is what's the most important out of all of this.
Very similar for lease negotiation priorities as well in each different stage of the career.
Absolutely. So lastly, I mentioned to you guys a call of action. This is what I would suggest. From my seat, it does not have to be with me. There's, like I said, there's plenty of other individuals that are experts in this space, but start having the conversation to review your cash flow, whether that's with a CPA that you trust, a dental specific CPA, or a banker. Have a conversation to really understand where your practice is at. We are experts in this field specifically to be able to help you understand what supply costs might be coming in at. Is your rent, what does that look like? To Eric's point earlier, if you want to move and buy a building or build a building, a lot of doctors out there talking about ground up construction. And what does that actually mean? How doable is that? What's your timeline? Is it reasonable? If you've got to be out of your spot in 12 months or you're month to month and you're trying to take out a ground up construction project, that might be a little tough. And we just got to work through those different options. So again, have the conversation, set up the meeting. Let's discuss your plans and where you ultimately see it. And don't feel like you have to have these items figured out, that you have to have these decisions made. It's just, again, informing and educating to what we see works or what doesn't, and giving you an idea of what the guardrails. So as you start to progress down a line, whether that's relocating or growing or staying, understanding what that looks like ultimately. With that, I apologize for the time here, and I know we're at 8, but I ultimately want to get you guys' questions. So thank you for the time so much, Eric and team, to be able to get a chance to talk to the group here.
No, we really appreciate it. Thank you, Matthew. And looking good. That was pre-Arizona, was it?
A lot more hair back then. It just kind of migrated. It's just kind of migrated south is how that's playing out so far.
That's the it's the COVID. It's the COVID beer. We've all got them. Yeah, no,
Exactly.
Truly huge appreciation every time. I have had the privilege of seeing that before, and it really does give a lot of good basics each and every time. And you're right, it's a multi-prong approach, and ultimately for those into that early stage, it's all about assembling the right professional team. So Mitchell, I know we've got a couple of key questions that have come through. As a reminder, feel free to jump onto the Q&A for absolutely anything. It can be done anonymously, etc. And happy to have some open conversations and keep the lines open through it. So the first question from Dr. R. I am in a 3,100 square foot building with 2 dental suites, an 1,800 square foot space, which is rented by my general dental practice, and a 1,300 square foot space rented by an oral surgery group. So that is right, owning their own space as well as having their own tenant. Both of us lease from an LLC owned by my wife. I'm looking to retire soon and sell my practice. I want to have an upgraded lease that will look attractive to buyers. Do you offer such a service? So Mitchell, that is a good question about the ALL or arm's length lease, as well as what are some key things to consider when structuring a lease to separate, right, one corporation that owns the building from the corporation that owns the practice. Mitchell.
Right, and there really is a lot to unpack there. One of the first things that comes to mind is the fact that if you're looking to sell the practice, say next week, next month, the problem with kind of all of the sudden backtracking and trying to draw up a lease contract kind of in the 11th hour of the seller's career, and really prepare the practice for its sale and get this buyer a copy of a new lease agreement, it's a fearful thing for the buyer to look at, right? You obviously have a vested interest in them buying the practice and then leasing space from you, but there's no validity to the rents. So if you haven't had a true historical track record of rents that have kind of proven money moving from tenant to landlord month over month, year over year, and there's no consistency, it would be a very intimidating thing for a buyer. So if I'm looking to buy a practice from Matt, and all of a sudden Matt draws up a lease agreement and there's rent rates pulled out of nowhere, it's an intimidating thing. So ideally, that arm's length lease, what Erica described, would be set up from years ago, so that there is a very valid historical track record worth of rents. So it's fair and in line with the market, of course, but it just proves, okay, next to payroll, I'm going to have the second largest expense for the practice, and it's detailed here in writing, and I know who I'm paying, whether it be an LLC or whether it be a shell company, whatever it is, whoever the landlord entity is. But drawing it up last minute is sometimes, more often than not, problematic. So for the doctor who would ask that question, maybe just bear in mind when you're looking to position the practice for sale. And then, yes, of course, we do offer a service for helping landlords draft a lease agreement for a property that they own. It's not just as simple as, preparing a lease agreement and using a kind of like a Word document. You really have to do a lot of that unique research that we had discussed throughout the earlier part of the presentation, where it is, okay, what is my fair market rental rate? What comparable properties near mine do I have to look at, and what rates are they asking for? What leasing transactions have taken place over the past 6 to 12 months to really prove the science for what is a fair market rent rate. And then you're going to detail that with some built-in increases over the next 5 to 10-year term to prove that very singular part of the lease. Again, that's just the rents, but you've got all the different legal portion or legal provisions to be included that are going to give you, the landlord, some kind of predictability and control over that tenant. So it's not just as simple as last minute drawing up a lease. Ideally, it's taking place earlier, much earlier and sooner than you're looking to sell the practice.
Yeah, just to add, Dr. R, it is at a 3,100 square foot building with the 2 suites at 1,800. So if you're looking to retire very soon, then yes, the sooner you get that in place, the better. And now you want to look at it from you and your wife's perspective in retirement. How does that look, right? How much control do you want the buyer to have? Right, do you want a triple net lease, meaning that every additional expense gets passed on to the buyer? Is it a gross lease where it's all included? It's a modified gross lease. There's lots of questions that we can go through that call. If you haven't already, I'd certainly suggest scheduling some time, and we can certainly have a good in-depth conversation about how to schedule that. And then, yes, we can certainly assist with that as well. Matthew, maybe to looking at that from a different perspective. Let's say it's a $1.5 million producing practice. Let's say the building's worth, $1 million. And you've got a buyer that says, great, I'd love to buy both, right? I've still got some student debt. I've bought some fancy cars, and now I want the big practice and the real estate. And right, what sort of guidance could you give to that sort of younger associate to sort of crawl, walk, run? Or how would you, what's some guidance there to help make sure that they haven't bought a bit more than they can chew?
Sure. I think that that last question you posed is the biggest one. Is we're going to really look at, especially on purchasing practice, is it a good marriage of the two? Is it a fit? A lot of times it is not necessarily the practice that is good or bad, and it's not the borrower or the doctor that's good or bad. It is the intermingling between the two, and does it work? So production ability is probably the number one thing I'll tell you that we'll look at on the practice side of, hey, if you're coming into this, do you have the ability to cover the production that's happening today? If not, then we have to solve for that, whether that be, there's maybe an associate in there already, or you bring in an associate. So the production ability of the doctor in question will absolutely play a role. The flip side to that, it goes back to the comment I made earlier, is how healthy is the practice? Is it low margins? So if there is a lot of personal debt or household obligations, is it going to be able to cover the borrower? Again, it can really go either way. The component I will say that matters the most, especially when you get to these larger transactions, is in fact liquidity, savings. Not because we necessarily want you to bring that money to the table and put it down, but it does show an ability to save for the rainy day. It does show an ability to hold on to resources so that if there is anything, when that transition does happen and now you have $2.5 million in practice and real estate debt, do you have the means in which to kind of ride out any bumpiness to the road? So those are the two pieces I will say. And there's a lot of really cool options out there as doctors in terms of financing, especially for real estate. It's just understanding what that looks like on the front end. So one example I'll say quickly is if any kind of, we call it SBA lending or government-backed lending, for example, which is common on doctors coming out and buying real estate for the first time, there's a requirement now that it didn't exist a few years back where you're having to bring 10% down to the whole situation. So in that scenario, it's $250,000. So it's a very easy delineation very quickly, right? Either you got $250,000 that you want to bring into that, or you don't. A lot of times we see doctors don't get that quick answer from lenders or anybody for that matter. And so they're kind of pushing this thing along and hoping for this, and they haven't reconciled maybe some of the key milestones that will come up, like an injection like that. But I would say production ability and savings will give you the most flexibility, especially if you don't have a track record of business ownership yet, and you're really trying to achieve something that might be a little bit larger than the average.
Great point. Looking at it from the buyer's perspective. Obviously, Dr. Ari, you're on the selling side, but I think some of the attendees here looking to buy or build and looking at it from the other side is key. And look, cash is king. As we saw last year, there was a big dry spell where there was no lending. Everything was shut down for a period of time. And, those with the cash reserves were able to weather the storm, and those that were pot committed for both the real estate and the practice, right? That's a ton of overhead, and you lose that flexibility. You are pot committed for that location for as long as that takes, especially if real estate values go down, especially if you needed to relocate and beyond. Perfect. If there's any additional questions, feel free to throw those through there. And finally, Matthew, all of your experience, Arizona, Texas, and beyond, what are some of the key things to, the common pitfalls that you've seen? Let that be with new associates or mid-career associates. What are some of the key things that you would say that if you were in their shoes to try to avoid or to protect themselves from, or not to fall into some of those common traps? What would you say are some of those perhaps 2 or 3 common mistakes that you see again and again?
Yeah, I think the doubt of the ability to own, and I'm not saying necessarily that every dentist should own out there, but there is a prevailing theme when doctors have been out for several years and they are either playing the associate game for years on end or being promised to buy into something, which is a common one. And they kind of lose this window of ability where the one resource none of us can get back or make more of is time. And so to be able to understand that, look, as a dentist or a healthcare professional in that matter, there is such an ability and availability of resources to start your business, to grow your business, and use quality partners to help you get there, that I think at least is unprecedented in any other industry out there. So if you were any other kind of industry professional trying to get a commercial loan, it is a lot. There's a little bit more of the hoops to jump through than there is as a dentist or as a healthcare provider. So I think knowing on the front end, at least having the conversation so that you can see how reasonable and potentially how easy, I mean, maybe simple is probably a better word, to get into practice ownership, to really influence and change the wealth accumulation that you're shooting for, or that frankly some of us go into the profession, and even a quality of life to be able to run and own your own business plays a definite role. So I think that if you ask me the number one pitfall, it is this kind of waiting game and this concern to be able to start sooner. And I would just tell anybody on the call, it probably can happen a lot sooner than you think, and that might even apply if you're an existing owner and trying to tackle another location or to expand. With a quality group of individuals to help you and assist you, there's not a whole lot you can't get to achieve to as a dental office. So
perfect. Yeah, I mean, look, we've had tons of associates that have come through and said it's a terrible time to be an associate, right? I'm not in control. I got laid off, right? I don't have nearly the flexibility. I don't like where things are going, and I want to be in control of my own destiny. I've seen enough. I'm ready to go. But it's tough to break the golden handcuffs, right? I'm paying off my debt. I don't want to take that risk, or I want to take that risk, right? But you're right. With the available team, with the available funding, it can take away a lot of that risk and certainly give that opportunity to own your own business, be your own boss, and more importantly, right, design that practice around your ultimate goals and not just be an employee forever and ever. Amen. Create something that could be worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in your eventual sale. So perfect. On that note, I see the vast majority of our attendees are still with us. So I really appreciate everyone's time. Matthew, can't thank you enough. Mitchell, thank you for joining us here as well. Again, if you haven't already, feel free to email us directly with a copy of your lease. If you do also want to have a good conversation with Matthew or one of the members of his team, his confirmation and email information is here as well. On that note, thank you very much, everybody, for your extra time. Hopefully we were helpful to answer a lot of those questions, and looking forward to speaking to you all and working with you soon. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a fantastic evening.